Sign or get out, my wife demanded in the house I paid cash for. I signed the papers, left the keys, and walked away. The next day her own, elite lawyer called her screaming, "Do you have any idea what you just let him do?" Let me tell you about the moment my marriage died, not with a bang, but with a leather Hermes folder sliding across Italian marble like a corporate termination notice. I was sitting on the stone patio of my lake house, the one I'd paid cash for 3 years ago when my legal tech startup hit its Series A milestone, watching the sun paint the water gold while I nursed my morning coffee. The house sat on 12 pristine acres in the Finger Lakes region, complete with a private dock where my 28-foot Catalina sailboat bobbed like a patient dog waiting for attention. I'd bought the place as a weekend retreat from the grinding machinery of New York's legal industry, somewhere I could think without the constant buzz of downtown Manhattan seeping into my skull. That's when Sabrina Voss, still technically my wife, though that technicality was about to get real interesting, stepped onto the patio in a silk La Perla robe that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She was carrying a tumbler of Macallan 25-year-old scotch, the bottle I'd been saving for when our company finally went public. The woman had absolutely zero sense of occasion, but perfect timing for psychological warfare. "Sign or get out," she said, dropping that leather folder in front of me with the kind of casual brutality you'd expect from a private equity vulture delivering bad news to a failing portfolio company. No preamble, no fake tears, no dramatic build-up. Just 4 words delivered with the emotional temperature of a board meeting discussing quarterly projections. I had to admire the efficiency, even if I wanted to throw my coffee mug at her surgically enhanced face. I opened the folder, keeping my expression as neutral as Switzerland during a hostile takeover. Inside, I found a greatest hits collection of legal documents that would have made my law school professors weep with pride at their clinical precision. A quitclaim deed transferring my interest in the property to her. A mutual separation agreement that read like it had been drafted by wolves. And my personal favorite, a neat itemized list of our shared assets that somehow included everything I'd owned before we got married. My Tesla Model X P100D, the one I'd custom-ordered in midnight silver metallic. My vintage tool collection, inherited from my grandfather who'd built half the barns in upstate New York with his bare hands. My sailboat, which I'd bought with my first legal counsel bonus check. Even my Patek Philippe watch, a law school graduation gift to myself that cost more than some people's cars. I kept my face blank, channeling every board meeting I'd ever sat through where someone was about to get fired. The expression that says, "I'm listening to your proposal with professional interest," while internally calculating exactly how badly you're about to get screwed. Sabrina was clearly loving this little performance. She'd been practicing this moment, probably in front of her bathroom mirror while getting ready for her daily Pilates sessions at that overpriced studio downtown. Over the past 6 months, she'd been collecting new friends like a venture capitalist collecting startups. Louder, more expensive friends who treated marriage like a leveraged buyout opportunity. And then there was Trent Harper, her business consultant, a gym tan charlatan who thought wearing a navy blazer over designer jeans made him look like a CFO instead of what he actually was. A glorified personal trainer with delusions of corporate grandeur. The guy had about as much business acumen as a golden retriever, but he looked good in Instagram photos, which apparently was Sabrina's new metric for professional competence. I picked up the Mont Blanc pen she'd given me for our 2nd anniversary, back when she still pretended to care about sentiment over asset allocation, and signed each document with the kind of clean, precise signature you develop when you're reviewing acquisition contracts worth 8 figures. No hesitation, no dramatic flourishes, no editing clauses or demanding explanations. Just Roman Mercer's name in black ink, applied with the mechanical efficiency of a compliance officer checking regulatory boxes. The whole process took maybe 90 seconds. Sabrina had probably expected tears, or shouting, or at least some pathetic attempt to negotiate terms like this was a plea deal instead of a divorce. Instead, she got to watch me execute her paperwork with all the emotional investment of a deputy manager approving expense reports. I stood up, placed the signed documents back in their leather folder, and set my house keys on the marble-top table next to her Macallan. Then I slipped my wedding ring off my finger, a simple platinum band that had cost more than most people's entire wedding, and placed it next to the keys with the kind of ceremonial precision usually reserved for resignation letters. The Tom Ford suit I was wearing probably cost more than Trent made in a month of consulting, and I wore it like armor as I walked through my own front door for what I knew would be the last time as a married man. The Italian wool moved with me like liquid confidence, each step measured and deliberate, as if I was stepping away from a hostile takeover attempt that had already failed before the opening bell. Behind me, I could hear Sabrina's breathing change, the subtle shift that happens when someone realizes their carefully orchestrated power play just got turned inside out. She'd expected my quiet demeanor to signal defeat, maybe even desperation. What she didn't understand, what she'd never understood during our 3 years of marriage, was that my silence wasn't surrender. It was structure. It was strategy. It was the calm that comes from knowing exactly what cards you're holding while your opponent is still trying to figure out what game they're playing. As I walked to my Tesla, I caught a glimpse of myself in the side mirror and almost smiled. 3 years ago, when I'd first started making real money from my legal tech company's AI contract analysis platform, I'd learned an important lesson from watching too many corporate restructurings go sideways. The loudest voice in the room is usually the weakest position. Sabrina thought she was holding all the assets. She thought her little folder of documents was a checkmate move, the kind of brilliant strategic thinking that would leave me homeless and humiliated while she redecorated my lake house, with Trent's dubious taste in contemporary furniture. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, because she'd never bothered to understand how I actually thought, was that I'd been playing a completely different game from day one. And now it was time to show her what a real acquisition looked like. 20 minutes after signing away what Sabrina thought was my entire life, I pulled my Tesla into a parking spot outside a red brick building that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought charm was a line item on a P&L statement. The ground floor housed a bakery that specialized in overpriced artisanal croissants for trust fund millennials, but the real business happened on the second floor, behind a door marked Hale and Rook CPAs in understated brass lettering. Arthur Hale had been guarding my financial life since I was a broke law school graduate with more student debt than sense and a business plan scribbled on coffee-stained napkins. Back then, I'd walked into his office wearing a Men's Warehouse suit that screamed recent graduate desperately pretending to have disposable income, asking him to help me structure a legal tech startup that existed mostly in my imagination and a prototype built in my studio apartment. Now, 8 years later, Arthur looked exactly the same. Rumpled Oxford shirt, reading glasses hanging from a chain like he was cosplaying a small-town bank president. But the numbers we were discussing had grown some serious zeros. He slid a black folder across his mahogany desk with the kind of satisfied expression usually reserved for chess masters revealing checkmate in 12 moves. Halcyon Harbor Trust, LLC, he said, tapping the folder with one finger like he was introducing me to my new best friend. I opened it and found the lake house title sitting there like a perfectly preserved artifact, completely insulated from the legal carnage Sabrina thought she'd just unleashed. The document was surrounded by corporate formation papers, trust agreements, and enough legal firepower to make a securities fraud prosecutor weep with joy. See, here's what happens when you're a corporate counsel who's spent years watching marriages implode faster than .com valuations during a market correction. You start thinking about risk mitigation the way venture capitalists think about portfolio diversification. After watching too many of my law school buddies get financially atomized in divorce proceedings that made hostile takeovers look like friendly handshake agreements, I'd done something that Sabrina's interior design brain apparently couldn't comprehend. I'd built redundancy into my personal life the same way I built it into our company's legal structure. The Halcyon Harbor Trust was a premarital discretionary trust I'd established 6 months before proposing to Sabrina, back when I still thought love was a sufficient hedge against stupidity. The trustee was me. The beneficiary was me. The trust was irrevocable until death or dissolution of marriage, with a few additional clauses that would have made a private equity lawyer shed tears of professional pride. Nina's been reviewing the documentation since you texted me this morning, Arthur said, nodding toward his senior associate, who was sitting in the corner with a laptop and the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for due diligence on billion-dollar acquisitions. Nina Cho had joined Hale and Rook 2 years ago after burning out at a Big Four accounting firm, where she'd specialized in forensic accounting for high-net-worth divorce cases. She understood money the way I understood contract law, as a system of interconnected rules that could be manipulated by anyone smart enough to read the fine print. "We've got a beautiful compliance trail," Nina said, pulling up a spreadsheet that looked like a military operation disguised as bookkeeping. "File notice of co-occupancy revocation. File freeze on any property improvements or modifications. Maintain documentation with scans, metadata, and clerk affidavits for everything." I leaned back in my chair, genuine leather, probably worth more than most people's monthly salary, and felt that familiar calm that comes from realizing you've been playing three-dimensional chess while your opponent was still learning checkers. Let me paint you a picture of who Roman Mercer actually is, since Sabrina apparently spent 3 years married to me without bothering to figure it out. I'm the co-founder and chief technology officer of Meridian Legal Analytics, a SaaS platform that uses artificial intelligence and machine learning to read through the kind of dense, jargon-heavy contracts that make normal human beings want to set things on fire. Our AI can scan a 200-page acquisition agreement and flag every potential risk, compliance issue, and hidden liability faster than a team of junior associates hopped up on Red Bull and career anxiety. We launched 3 years ago with $2.3 million in series of funding from a venture capital firm that specialized in legal tech startups. Last quarter, we closed our Series B round at a $47 million valuation, and I still maintain a controlling equity stake that makes me sleep very well at night on Egyptian cotton sheets. But that's just the company that pays the bills and funds my lifestyle. On the side, I work as a corporate counsel and strategic advisor for Blackstone Harbor, a mid-tier private equity fund that specializes in acquiring distressed companies and restructuring them into profitable portfolio assets. I review their acquisition targets, assess regulatory compliance issues, and occasionally sit in on board meetings where we decide which companies live, die, or get sold to larger competitors. It's the kind of work that teaches you to think systematically about risk, to build multiple contingency plans, and to never, ever assume that someone who claims to love you won't try to financially destroy you the moment the relationship goes sideways. "You built redundancy into your life," Arthur said, closing the folder with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just watched his favorite chess strategy play out exactly as planned. "Now you get to use it." I nodded, already mentally reviewing the next phase of what was starting to feel less like a divorce and more like a corporate restructuring. The kind where you identify underperforming assets, isolate them from the core business, and then execute a clean separation that protects the valuable intellectual property while minimizing exposure to legacy liabilities. In this case, the underperforming asset was a wife who'd apparently confused community property with hostile takeover opportunity. The valuable intellectual property was everything I'd built, earned, and accumulated through years of 80-hour weeks and strategic career moves. And the legacy liability was whatever financial damage she thought she could inflict with her leather folder full of worthless paper. "I don't need to raise my voice," I told Arthur, standing up and straightening my Tom Ford jacket. "I only need to raise the right paperwork." He snorted, the sound of a man who'd spent 30 years watching people learn expensive lessons about the difference between feeling powerful and actually having power. As I walked toward the door, Nina called out one final detail that made my day feel complete. "Oh, and Roman? The trust documentation includes a provision for legal fees. Whatever this costs us, it's a business expense." Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Time to teach Sabrina Voss what a real acquisition looked like. The Finger Lakes County Courthouse looked like it had been designed by someone who thought imposing meant built with enough limestone to intimidate small nations. I pulled into the visitor parking lot at exactly 8:47 a.m., giving myself 12 minutes to execute what was about to become the most satisfying paperwork filing of my entire legal career. Nina was already waiting by the courthouse steps, looking like a compliance officer who'd had too much coffee and not enough patience for bureaucratic inefficiency. She was carrying a leather messenger bag that probably contained enough legal documentation to make a securities fraud prosecutor weep with professional joy, and wearing the kind of sharp business suit that said, "I charge by the hour and my hours are expensive." "Everything's queued up," she said, handing me a manila folder thick enough to stop a bullet. "County clerk opens at 9, but Ms. Rojas usually gets in 15 minutes early to process the overnight drop-off queue. I love working with people who understand that timing isn't just about being punctual. It's about understanding the administrative machinery that keeps the legal system grinding forward like a well-oiled corporate acquisition. Most people think law is about arguing in courtrooms and delivering dramatic closing statements. In reality, 90% of legal warfare happens in filing cabinets and records offices, where the right document stamped at the right time can obliterate someone's entire strategic position. We walk through the courthouse's marble lobby, past oil paintings of dead judges who probably never had to deal with Instagram-addicted wives trying to steal lake houses through emotional manipulation. The building smelled like old books, floor wax, and the faint desperation of people who discovered that family court is significantly less entertaining than Judge Judy makes it look. Ms. Carmen Rojas had been the county clerk for something like 2 decades, which meant she'd seen every possible variation of human stupidity play out across her desk. She was a small woman with silver hair and the kind of patient, weathered expression that comes from watching people destroy their lives one poorly executed legal strategy at a time. "Morning, Ms. Rojas," I said, sliding our documentation across her counter with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years filing corporate compliance reports. Trust documentation, property freeze notices, and co-occupancy revocation. All the forms are complete. Fees are included. She looked at the paperwork with the methodical precision of someone who understood that her signature and official stamp were about to set off a legal chain reaction that would probably end up in someone's divorce attorney's case files. Nina had prepared everything according to New York State requirements, with multiple copies, proper formatting, and enough cross-references to make a federal prosecutor jealous. "Halcyon Harbor Trust, LLC," Ms. Rojas read aloud, flipping through the pages like she was reviewing a particularly interesting novel. "Property freeze effective immediately. Co-occupancy revocation notice to be served on." She paused, looking up at me with the expression of someone who'd just realized she was about to become part of what was probably going to be a very expensive legal drama. "Sabrina Voss," I confirmed. "Current occupant of the property, but not the legal owner. The trust holds clear title, and we're exercising our right to restrict occupancy pending resolution of the marital dissolution." She nodded, pulling out her official stamp with the kind of ceremonial gravity usually reserved for board meetings where someone's about to get fired. The first stamp came down at exactly 8:59 a.m., filed, with today's date and Ms. Rojas's initials, officially entered into the county record system where it would live forever like a legal time bomb. Each additional stamp felt like watching a perfectly executed hostile takeover unfold in real time. "Property freeze, filed. Co-occupancy revocation, filed. Trust beneficiary notification, filed." By the time she finished, we had a complete paper trail that would make any litigation team proud and any opposing counsel very, very nervous. "Certified copies will be available this afternoon," Ms. Rojas said, handing me the receipt with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested she'd probably seen this exact scenario play out before. "Certified mail notices go out today?" "Already queued," Nina confirmed, tapping her phone screen. "Process server has been notified, and we've got delivery confirmation set up for all parties." As we walked back toward the parking lot, I pulled out my iPhone and checked my email, because even when you're busy destroying your soon-to-be ex-wife's legal position, the business world keeps spinning. My inbox was already filling up with the usual morning chaos. Quarterly reports from our portfolio companies, compliance updates from Blackstone Harbor's legal team, and a Series B term sheet from Jensen & Associates, a venture capital firm I'd been courting for our next funding round. The term sheet looked promising, $15 million at a $78 million pre-money valuation, with anti-dilution provisions that would protect my equity stake and liquidation preferences that heavily favored early investors. Our AI contract analysis platform had been showing consistent month-over-month growth, with customer acquisition costs trending down and lifetime value metrics that made our board meetings feel like victory laps. Even in the middle of personal legal warfare, I kept the company steady. That's what separates successful entrepreneurs from the ones who let their personal drama tank their professional obligations. Calm isn't just an emotional state. It's a hedge against letting temporary chaos destroy long-term value creation. I climbed back into my Tesla, letting the autopilot system handle the morning traffic while I reviewed the rest of my messages. Our CFO had sent overnight metrics showing our customer churn rate had dropped to 3%, well below industry benchmarks for B2B SaaS platforms. Our enterprise clients were renewing at rates that suggested we'd built something genuinely valuable instead of just another legal tech startup promising to revolutionize the industry with machine learning algorithms that couldn't actually parse complex contract language. The drive back toward town took me past the lake house, where I could see Sabrina's BMW X5 still parked in what she probably thought was her driveway. By now, she was probably waking up to discover that her brilliant legal strategy had about as much structural integrity as a cryptocurrency pyramid scheme. I didn't slow down or look too closely. There would be plenty of time for observation later, after the certified mail arrived, and she realized that her leather folder full of worthless documents had just collided with the kind of systematic legal preparation that comes from understanding how power actually works. The rest of my morning was going to involve strategic planning, risk assessment, and the kind of methodical execution that separates successful acquisitions from expensive disasters. Sabrina wanted to play corporate warfare with someone who'd spent years studying exactly how these battles are won and lost. She was about to get a very expensive education. I was sitting in a vinyl booth at Murphy's Diner, the kind of place where the coffee comes in thick ceramic mugs that could double as weapons, and the waitresses have been calling everyone Han since the Carter administration, when my phone buzzed with a text from Kai Donovan that would make my entire legal strategy feel like Christmas morning. Kai and I went way back to our law school days at Columbia, back when we thought pulling all-nighters in the library and surviving on vending machine coffee made us some kind of academic warriors. Now he was a partner at Morrison, Klein & Associates, one of those white-shoe Manhattan firms that charged clients more per hour than most people made in a month, specializing in intellectual property litigation for tech companies with more money than sense. His text was exactly 3 words. Check this out, followed by a link that made my morning significantly more interesting. I clicked through to Instagram, and there it was, Sabrina's latest masterpiece of social media narcissism, a 30-second reel that was about to become Exhibit A in what was shaping up to be the most satisfying legal demolition of my career. The video opened with Sabrina on my dock. Excuse me, the Halcyon Harbor Trust dock, wearing a white sundress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She was barefoot, toes painted some shade of red that matched her wine glass, standing next to Trent Harper like they were posing for a couple's retreat brochure. But here's where it got really beautiful. They were clinking glasses, champagne flutes filled with what looked like Dom Perignon, because apparently Trent's consulting business was lucrative enough to afford $300 bottles of bubbly. And then, in a moment of pure social media gold, Sabrina leaned in and kissed him. Not a friendly peck, not an air kiss for the camera, but a full romantic clinch that screamed, "We're together, and we don't care who knows it." The caption made me want to frame the screenshot. Finally free, ready to start this new chapter with my amazing partner. Life is too short for anything less than pure happiness. Two Heart Sparkles # new beginnings # fresh start # living my best life. And then, because the universe apparently has a sense of humor about legal strategy, she tagged the location. Halcyon Harbor Estate, Finger Lakes region. I saved the video to my phone, screenshot the caption, pulled the GPS metadata, and immediately forwarded everything to Nina with a message that probably made her spit coffee all over her laptop. Clause 8 is officially alive and breathing. Her response came back in under 60 seconds. Holy shit. She just handed us a federal case. See, here's what happens when you're married to a legal tech entrepreneur who builds AI systems designed to parse complex contracts and flag potential violations. You tend to write your personal agreements with the same obsessive attention to detail that you'd use for a billion-dollar acquisition. The mutual separation agreement that Sabrina thought she was so clever about had an addendum, Clause 8, subsection 3, that I'd insisted on including back when we were still pretending this marriage might work out. It stated, in language clear enough for a first-year law student to understand, that any post-separation cohabitation or demonstrated intent to liquidate marital assets within 90 days would immediately void any property transfer agreements. The legal term is material breach through affirmative conduct. The practical translation is, if you're stupid enough to publicly document that you're living with your new boyfriend in property you're trying to steal, you just invalidated your own legal position. But wait, it gets better. Our company's flagship AI contract analysis platform, the one that had earned us $15 million in Series B funding and a customer base that included 3 of the top 10 law firms in Manhattan, included a natural language processing module specifically designed to identify intent verbs in legal documents. Words and phrases that indicate someone's planning to do something that might violate contract terms. I pulled up our beta testing interface on my phone and ran Sabrina's Instagram caption through our semantic analysis engine. The results came back like a compliance officer's fever dream. Finally free, start this new chapter, fresh start, and living my best life, all got flagged as high probability indicators of intent to permanently separate from previous obligations. In other words, our own AI system had just identified Sabrina's social media post as evidence of material breach in a contract dispute. I was using machine learning algorithms to build a divorce case, and it was working better than I'd ever imagined possible. I forwarded the AI analysis to Nina with a note. When you build tools for litigators, you start using them at home. The diner was starting to fill up with the usual morning crowd, contractors heading to job sites, office workers grabbing coffee before facing another day of corporate soul-crushing, retirees who treated breakfast out like a social event. All of them probably had relationship drama of their own, but none of them were married to someone stupid enough to create their own evidence trail on social media. My phone rang. Nina, calling from what sounded like the inside of a very expensive law office with marble floors and the kind of ambient noise that suggested associates billing $400 per hour. I've been reviewing the footage, she said without preamble. The timestamp shows it was posted at 11:47 p.m. last night, roughly 14 hours after she received your signed separation agreement. The GPS metadata confirms it was taken on the trust property, and the content clearly indicates cohabitation with a third party. How clear? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Clear enough that opposing counsel is going to spend their weekend trying to figure out how to make this disappear. Clear enough that we can file for immediate enforcement of the property freeze. Clear enough that she just turned a complex marital dissolution into a slam-dunk breach of contract case. I took a sip of coffee that tasted like victory mixed with caffeine and a hint of small-town charm. Through the diner window, I could see my Tesla parked next to a pickup truck that probably cost less than my monthly software licensing fees, but somehow both vehicles looked perfectly content in the morning sunlight. File everything, I told Nina. Full enforcement, immediate compliance review, and make sure we document every frame of that video before she realizes what she's done and tries to delete it. Already done. I've got screenshots, metadata, cache versions, and a forensic digital preservation notice ready to file with the county clerk. This was why I paid Nina enough to afford her Upper West Side apartment and her collection of designer suits that made her look like she could buy and sell small countries. She understood that in legal warfare, timing isn't just important, it's everything. Sabrina wanted to play social media games with someone who'd built a career on understanding exactly how digital evidence works in court. She was about to discover that Instagram doesn't have an undo button for stupidity. While Sabrina was busy filming a makeup tutorial in what she still thought was her bathroom, something about glowing up after toxic relationships that probably had her Instagram followers eating up every manufactured moment of empowerment. Mr. Vincent Leone was walking up the stone pathway to deliver the kind of legal reality check that makes people suddenly very interested in reading fine print. Leone had been serving legal documents in the Finger Lakes region for nearly 20 years, long enough to develop the kind of professional detachment that comes from watching people's entire lives change the moment they signed for certified mail. He looked like Central Casting's idea of a process server, mid-50s, unremarkable clothes, the sort of guy who could blend into any crowd until the moment he needed to hand you papers that would ruin your weekend. Nina had briefed him that morning with the kind of tactical precision usually reserved for corporate raids. Target, Sabrina Voss, current unlawful occupant of 847 Lakeshore Drive. Documents, property freeze notice, co-occupancy revocation, and breach of contract enforcement from Halcyon Harbor Trust LLC. Timing: during business hours, with independent witness if possible. Leone knocked on the front door at exactly 2:17 p.m., just as Sabrina was wrapping up her makeup tutorial with some inspirational nonsense about choosing yourself and not letting anyone dim your shine. Through the window, he could see ring lights and camera equipment set up in what was clearly an expensive renovation of the master bathroom. Marble countertops, designer fixtures, and enough luxury skincare products to stock a Sephora. When she opened the door, still holding her phone and probably expecting a delivery of organic kombucha or whatever overpriced wellness product was trending that week, Leone's expression was as neutral as a Swiss banker discussing tax shelters. "Sabrina Voss?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Professional process servers don't guess about identity. They confirm it with the kind of methodical precision that makes their testimony hold up in court. "Yes," she said, with that particular tone of someone who was used to being the most important person in any conversation. She was wearing yoga pants that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget, and a crop top that suggested she'd been spending considerable time with Trent's personal training services. "You're served," Leone said, handing her the manila envelope with the kind of ceremonial gravity usually reserved for handing over keys to a new CEO. "Property freeze notice and related documentation. Please sign here acknowledging receipt." The affidavit Leone filed later that afternoon read like a weather report, calm, precise, and utterly devastating in its clinical objectivity. Subject appeared surprised and initially refused to accept service. Subject asked multiple questions about the nature of the documentation. Subject signed receipt at 2:19 p.m. with witness present, Mrs. Dorothy Chun, neighbor, walking dog. Subject appeared to understand the significance of the documentation upon initial review. What Leone's affidavit didn't capture was the exact moment when Sabrina's expression shifted from confused irritation to dawning horror as she skimmed through the legal language that was about to turn her Instagram-perfect life into a compliance nightmare. Property freeze. Immediate cessation of occupancy rights. Breach of contract enforcement. Legal fees and damages. The first call she made was to Graham Wolf at Wolf, Pritchard & Bell, the kind of white shoe Manhattan law firm that charged $850 per hour and decorated their offices with original oil paintings that cost more than most people's houses. Wolf had been handling elite divorces for 15 years, which meant he specialized in helping wealthy people destroy each other with the kind of surgical precision that made federal prosecutors jealous. His office occupied 3 floors of a midtown building with marble floors that echoed like a cathedral and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of Central Park. The kind of space designed to make clients feel like their legal fees were buying them not just representation, but membership in some exclusive club where justice was a luxury service available to anyone with sufficient assets under management. I didn't hear the actual phone call, but I didn't need to. Nina had been monitoring the opposing counsel database, and by 4:30 p.m., she'd received an automated notice that Wolf, Pritchard, and Bell had officially entered their appearance as counsel of record for Sabrina Voss in the matter of Halcyon Harbor Trust LLC v. Voss. The paralegal who texted me the summary was Jessica Martinez, someone I'd mentored during her first year at Morrison, Klein & Associates before she'd moved to a boutique firm that specialized in high-net-worth family law. She still owed me a favor from when I'd helped her draft a particularly complex prenuptial agreement for a tech entrepreneur who was paranoid about protecting his cryptocurrency portfolio. Her message was exactly the kind of inside intelligence that made maintaining professional relationships worth the investment. Holy shit, Roman. Wolf just spent 45 minutes on the phone with your wife, and I've never seen him look that defeated after an intake call. He kept asking her if she had any original documentation and whether there were any neutral witnesses to the property transfer. Then he asked about social media posts. She apparently didn't understand why that mattered. But the real gold came in her follow-up text. I was in the conference room when he hung up. His exact words were, "Do you have any idea what you just let him do?" Then he asked his senior associate to pull every filing from the county clerk's office and started muttering something about premarital trusts and social media evidence. By 5:15 p.m., Wolf had received copies of every document we'd filed, including the original trust formation papers, the property freeze notice, and, my personal favorite, screenshots of Sabrina's Instagram reel with timestamps, GPS metadata, and our AI semantic analysis highlighting every phrase that constituted evidence of material breach. I could picture him in his corner office, probably nursing a tumbler of scotch that cost more than most people's weekly salary, staring at documentation that read like a masterclass in legal preparation. The kind of systematic, redundant, multiply-verified paper trail that made opposing counsel realize they weren't just fighting a divorce. They were fighting someone who'd been thinking 3 moves ahead since before the marriage started falling apart. In family court, you don't lose to dramatic testimony or emotional appeals. You lose to footnotes, timestamps, and properly executed documentation that proves your client just made a series of very expensive mistakes. Wolf was about to spend his weekend explaining to Sabrina that her leather folder full of worthless papers had just collided with the kind of legal preparation that comes from understanding how corporate acquisitions actually work. And the billable hours were going to be absolutely brutal. The beautiful thing about systematic financial destruction is that it doesn't require drama, shouting matches, or throwing expensive glassware across marble countertops. It just requires understanding which systems are connected to which accounts, and then methodically cutting the connections with the precision of a private equity firm restructuring an underperforming portfolio company. I started with the joint checking account at First National, the one Sabrina had been using like her personal ATM for the past 6 months. The account that funded her Pilates sessions, her organic meal delivery service, her weekly trips to that overpriced salon where they charged $300 for highlights that made her look like every other Upper West Side trophy wife desperately clinging to relevance. One phone call to Marcus Webb, my relationship manager at the bank, the kind of guy who handled accounts for clients with enough liquid assets to make small countries jealous, and the joint account was closed. Not frozen, not restricted, but completely terminated with all remaining funds transferred to my individual business account at Chase Private Client. Standard dissolution procedure, Mr. Mercer, Marcus confirmed over the phone, his voice carrying that particular tone of discretion that comes from spending years managing the financial lives of people who could buy and sell his annual salary with their quarterly dividend payments. All authorized users have been removed, all linked automatic payments have been canceled, and we've sent notification letters to both account holders as required by federal banking regulations. The joint credit card was next, the American Express Centurion card that Sabrina had been treating like a license to print money. One call to the concierge service, and her authorization was revoked faster than a startup's valuation during a market correction. The card that had funded her shopping sprees at Bergdorf Goodman, her weekend getaways to boutique hotels in the Hamptons, her collection of designer handbags that cost more than most people's cars. But here's where it gets really satisfying. The card wasn't actually joint credit. It was my personal account, tied to my credit profile, my income verification, my assets under management. Sabrina had been an authorized user, which meant she'd been spending my money with my permission. Permission that could be revoked with a single phone call and about 30 seconds of digital paperwork. The Cadillac Escalade she'd been driving around like she was auditioning for a Real Housewives spinoff? That got even more interesting. The lease was structured through Halcyon Harbor Trust LLC as a business vehicle, which meant it was technically a corporate asset that I controlled as both trustee and primary beneficiary. One call to the leasing company, and the vehicle was flagged for return to the registered owner within 48 hours. We'll need the vehicle returned to our Syracuse location, the fleet manager explained with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that suggested he'd handled plenty of corporate restructurings where somebody's company car suddenly wasn't theirs anymore. All personal items should be removed, and we'll need both sets of keys plus any electronic access devices. The country club membership was particularly elegant in its simplicity. Sabrina loved bragging about her access to Lakeview Country Club, with its championship golf course, its Olympic-sized swimming pool, and its dining room where she could hold court with other women who'd married their way into membership. What she'd never bothered to understand was that her access came through my shareholder privileges in Meridian Hospitality Group, the investment consortium that owned controlling interest in the club. One email to David Chun, the general manager, and her membership privileges were suspended pending ownership restructuring. No dramatic confrontation, no public embarrassment, just a quiet administrative adjustment that would leave her standing at the front gate like a tourist trying to talk her way into a private party. The most beautiful part was the wine cellar access. Sabrina had been using my climate-controlled storage unit at Premier Wine Storage to house her collection of overpriced bottles that she'd been buying with what she thought was our shared money. The facility charged $1,200 per month for premium storage, with temperature and humidity controls that kept her Bordeaux and Champagne collections in pristine condition. But the lease was in my name, paid through my business accounts, and secured by my personal guarantee. One phone call, and her access keycard was deactivated. All that Dom Perignon and Chateau Margaux, sitting in temperature-controlled luxury while she lost the ability to retrieve any of it. We'll need written authorization from the primary leaseholder for any future access, the storage manager confirmed. All current access codes have been reset, and we've updated our security protocols accordingly. Our startup's CFO, Patricia Liu, had been monitoring the situation with the kind of professional interest that comes from managing the financial operations of a company valued at nearly $50 million. When I called her that afternoon to review the expense matrix changes, she was practically purring with satisfaction. "I've isolated all personal expenses from the business accounts," she reported, her voice carrying the tone of someone who'd spent years protecting corporate assets from personal liability exposure. "Your expense account has been restructured to exclude any shared or ambiguous charges. Everything gets routed through your personal accounts now, with clear documentation for tax and compliance purposes." Patricia understood corporate finance the way I understood contract law, as a system of interconnected rules that could be manipulated by anyone smart enough to read the regulatory requirements. She'd spent 5 years at Goldman Sachs before joining our startup, which meant she knew exactly how to build financial firewalls that would protect our business from whatever personal legal drama was about to unfold. "I've also flagged all previous shared expenses for forensic accounting review," she added. "If opposing counsel tries to claim any business assets as marital property, we've got a complete audit trail showing clear separation between personal and corporate finances." But I wasn't completely heartless. I told Arthur to leave Sabrina some operational capital, enough to maintain basic living expenses for about 60 days. Good optics matter in family court, and I didn't want some judge thinking I was trying to leave her destitute and desperate. "She wants the illusion of control," I explained to Arthur as we reviewed the financial restructuring. "Let her keep the illusion for a few weeks. It'll give her enough rope to make more mistakes." He snorted, the sound of a man who'd spent 30 years watching people confuse feeling powerful with actually having power. "Illusion isn't an asset class, Roman, and it sure as hell isn't collateral for legal fees." By the time the sun set over the lake, Sabrina's access to my financial ecosystem had been systematically terminated with the efficiency of a corporate downsizing. Not seized, not stolen, just properly reallocated to reflect the actual ownership structure that had always existed beneath the surface. She'd wanted to play financial warfare with someone who'd built his career on understanding exactly how money flows through legal and corporate systems. The education was going to be expensive. The thing about high-net-worth social circles is that information travels faster than insider trading rumors on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. By 11:30 a.m., less than 18 hours after the property freeze notice had been served, Sabrina's carefully cultivated client base was evaporating like venture capital funding during a market crash. Daphne Whitmore was the first domino to fall, and she fell hard. Daphne lived in a $12 million penthouse on the Upper West Side that overlooked Central Park like a monument to generational wealth and impeccable taste. She'd hired Sabrina 6 months ago to redesign her master bedroom suite, a project that involved enough marble, custom millwork, and designer fixtures to fund a small startup Series A round. The renovation was supposed to showcase Sabrina's transition from suburban interior designer to Manhattan luxury consultant. The kind of career pivot that required serious capital investment and even more serious networking. Daphne wasn't just a client. She was a gateway into the kind of social ecosystem where people casually dropped $200,000 on bathroom renovations and thought nothing of flying to Milan to personally select marble for their kitchen islands. But here's what happens when your interior designer suddenly becomes the subject of property freeze notices and breach of contract litigation. Your friends start asking uncomfortable questions about whether their deposits are insured and whether their contractor is financially stable enough to complete a six-figure renovation. Daphne's call came at exactly 11:47 a.m., and I only heard about it because Patricia Liu had been monitoring our business accounts for any unusual activity. Sabrina's business checking account, which she'd opened using our joint credit as collateral, showed a wire transfer reversal for $85,000, followed by a memo that read like a corporate compliance notice. Project suspension pending resolution of legal issues affecting contractor stability. In other words, Daphne had pulled the plug faster than a venture capitalist discovering undisclosed liabilities during due diligence. Marisol Fontaine went next, and her defection was even more brutal. Marisol owned a $20 million estate in the Hamptons, complete with a wine cellar that could house a small vineyard's worth of vintage bottles. She'd commissioned Sabrina to design a tasting room that would rival the best private clubs in Napa Valley. Custom climate control, hand-carved storage systems, lighting that made every bottle look like a piece of art. But Marisol didn't just cancel her contract. She pulled it through her lawyers at Cravath, Swaine & Moore, one of those white shoe firms where the partners bill enough per hour to fund small countries. Her termination letter was a masterpiece of legal precision, citing material concerns regarding contractors' financial stability and ongoing litigation exposure as grounds for immediate contract dissolution with full deposit recovery. The real devastation came through social media, but not in the way you'd expect. There was no public drama, no angry Instagram posts, no Twitter threads about unreliable contractors. Instead, Sabrina simply disappeared from the feeds of people who mattered. The private Facebook group Curated Spaces, an invitation-only network of interior designers, architects, and clients with enough disposable income to treat home renovation like a competitive sport, had been Sabrina's primary lead generation machine. It was where she'd built her reputation as someone who could handle complex, high-budget projects for clients who expected perfection and had the bank accounts to pay for it. But luxury markets operate on trust, and trust evaporates the moment legal documents start flying. By noon, screenshots of the property freeze notice were circulating through private messages like classified intelligence reports. Not maliciously, not vindicatively, just as the kind of risk assessment information that wealthy people share to protect each other from potentially expensive mistakes. Vendors started switching her to prepay terms faster than startups pivot during market downturns. The custom furniture workshop that had been crafting Daphne's bedroom pieces suddenly required full payment up front instead of their usual net 30 terms. The lighting designer working on Marisol's wine cellar demanded cash on delivery. The marble supplier in New Jersey that had been extending her trade credit suddenly wanted certified funds before releasing any inventory. In the luxury goods world, credit terms are a privilege extended to contractors with proven track records and stable financial profiles. The moment your business starts attracting legal notices and property disputes, you get reclassified from preferred vendor to cash-only risk, which is basically the commercial equivalent of getting kicked out of the country club. Sabrina's assistant, Madison Torres, quit with the kind of graceful resignation letter that suggested she'd been watching the situation deteriorate and had already lined up alternative employment. Madison was nobody's fool. She'd worked for enough high-end interior designers to recognize when a business was transitioning from exclusive boutique firm to expensive legal liability. Her departure was particularly devastating because Madison hadn't just been handling administrative work. She'd been managing client relationships, coordinating vendor schedules, and maintaining the kind of detailed project management systems that luxury renovation projects require. Losing her was like having your CFO resign right before an IPO. Technically survivable, but practically catastrophic. At 4 p.m., I was sitting in our weekly board meeting at Meridian Legal Analytics, reviewing quarterly metrics in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows and whiteboards covered in machine learning flowcharts. Our enterprise client acquisition was up 23% quarter over quarter. Our AI contract analysis platform was processing nearly 50,000 documents per month, and our customer satisfaction scores were high enough to make our venture capital investors very happy about their Series B investment. But even while I was approving strategic decisions about our next product launch and reviewing our intellectual property portfolio, I was getting real-time updates about Sabrina's professional collapse through Nina's text messages. Each update felt like watching a hostile takeover succeed in slow motion. High-net-worth clients don't fear moral failures or personal drama. They fear operational instability. They fear contractors who might not finish projects on time, vendors who might not deliver custom orders, designers who might not be around to handle warranty issues or future modifications. One legal flag plus one careless Instagram reel had transformed Sabrina from exclusive luxury consultant to potential business interruption risk, and wealthy people don't take risks with six-figure renovation projects. The market had spoken, and it had spoken with the kind of brutal efficiency that makes corporate restructuring look gentle by comparison. She'd wanted to play reputation games with someone who understood exactly how professional credibility gets built and destroyed in high-stakes markets. The lesson was going to cost her everything she'd spent 3 years trying to build. Graham Wolfe pulled his BMW X7 into the circular driveway of what Sabrina still thought was her lake house at exactly 5:47 p.m., carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive enough to fund a small legal tech startup, and wearing the kind of grim expression usually reserved for partners explaining to clients why their litigation strategy just became significantly more expensive. The briefcase was fat enough to bruise someone if used as a weapon, stuffed with enough legal documentation to make a federal prosecutor jealous. Over the past 6 hours, Wolfe had deployed a team of associates and paralegals to conduct what amounted to a forensic autopsy of Sabrina's legal position, and the results were about as encouraging as a compliance audit conducted by the SEC. Wolfe had pulled property deeds going back 15 years, trust formation documents, county filing records, and enough banking statements to reconstruct the entire financial history of my relationship with Sabrina. He'd reviewed the original separation agreement she'd been so proud of, cross-referenced it with the trust documentation, and analyzed every clause with the kind of systematic precision that justified his $850 per hour billing rate. What he discovered was essentially the legal equivalent of finding out your acquisition target had been cooking their books for 3 years while their CEO was secretly planning to sell the company's intellectual property to competitors. The lake house had never been marital property. The Halcyon Harbor Trust had been established 6 months before our wedding, with me as both trustee and primary beneficiary, structured as an irrevocable premarital asset that couldn't be touched by divorce proceedings unless specific conditions were met. The separation agreement Sabrina had been waving around like a victory flag was essentially worthless paper, a quitclaim deed to property I'd never legally owned in my individual capacity. But the real masterpiece was Clause 8, Subsection 3, the addendum that had been sitting in the separation agreement like a legal landmine waiting for someone to step on it. Any post-separation cohabitation or demonstrated intent to liquidate marital assets within 90 days would immediately void any property transfer agreements and trigger what lawyers call material breach through affirmative conduct. In practical terms, this meant that Sabrina's Instagram reel hadn't just been a moment of social media narcissism. It had been a legally admissible confession that she was violating the terms of her own separation agreement less than 24 hours after signing it. Wolfe found Sabrina on the patio where this entire legal disaster had started, sitting in one of the teak chairs I'd bought during a weekend trip to a designer furniture warehouse in Albany. She was drinking wine from a bottle that probably cost more than most people's car payments, wearing a sundress that suggested she still thought her biggest problem was choosing the right Instagram filter. "We need to talk," Wolfe said, settling into the chair across from her with the kind of ceremonial gravity usually reserved for board meetings where someone's about to be fired. He opened his briefcase and began laying out documents with the systematic precision of a pathologist examining evidence at a crime scene. The first document was the original trust formation paperwork, stamped and notarized, showing the lake house property had been purchased and titled under Halcyon Harbor Trust LLC with Roman Mercer as sole trustee and beneficiary. The purchase date preceded our marriage by 6 months, which meant it had always been separate property under New York state law. This property was never marital, Wolfe explained. his voice carrying the kind of patient precision that comes from spending years explaining expensive legal mistakes to clients who thought they understood contract law. Your separation agreement was attempting to transfer property that your husband never owned in his individual capacity. The second document was even more devastating. A copy of the separation agreement with Clause 8 highlighted in bright yellow like evidence in a federal securities fraud case. Wolf had attached printed screenshots of Sabrina's Instagram reel, complete with timestamps, GPS metadata, and what looked like a linguistic analysis that would make our AI contract platform proud. This social media post constitutes clear evidence of material breach, Wolf continued, pointing to specific phrases in the caption with the kind of methodical detail usually reserved for explaining SEC violations to corporate executives. The timing, location, and content all establish that you've been cohabitating with a third party on property you're attempting to claim through the separation agreement. Sabrina's expression shifted from confused annoyance to dawning horror as she began to understand that her carefully orchestrated power play had just collided with the kind of legal preparation that comes from understanding how corporate acquisitions actually work. The wine glass in her hand started trembling slightly, like a seismograph detecting the early stages of a financial earthquake. "What does this mean?" she asked, though the tone of her voice suggested she already suspected the answer was going to be expensive and humiliating. Wolf pulled out the third document, a property freeze notice that had been filed with the county clerk and served by a process server with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that makes legal documentation admissible in court. The notice established that any attempts to modify, improve, or transfer the property would be considered contempt of court and subject to immediate enforcement action. "It means you're living in a house you have no legal right to occupy," Wolf explained with the kind of clinical detachment that suggested he'd had this exact conversation with other clients who'd confused Instagram validation with legal strategy. "It means the separation agreement you signed is legally worthless. And it means your social media activity has created admissible evidence that you've been violating the terms of your own contract." But the real devastation came with the fourth document. A forensic accounting report showing that virtually every asset Sabrina thought she'd been entitled to through the separation agreement was either held in trust, structured as business property, or protected by premarital agreements that predated their marriage. The Tesla was leased through my business account. The sailboat was titled under the trust. Even the vintage tool collection had been cataloged and appraised as inherited property with clear documentation showing it had never been marital assets. "Your husband didn't just plan for divorce," Wolf said, closing his briefcase with the kind of finality usually associated with bankruptcy proceedings. "He systematically structured his entire financial life to be divorce-proof before he ever proposed to you." He told her to go dark immediately. No social media posts, no public statements, no communication with third parties about the ongoing litigation. In their world, this was called damage control. In mine, it was called about 3 years too late. As Wolf's BMW disappeared down the driveway, he was probably already calculating the billable hours this case was going to generate and wondering how to explain to his client that she'd just handed her husband a litigation-grade victory through sheer stupidity and social media narcissism. The education was going to cost more than her entire interior design business had ever earned. Midnight has always been my favorite time for strategic thinking. There's something about the absolute silence of 12 a.m. that strips away all the noise, all the distractions, all the meaningless chatter that clutters up business hours and makes it hard to focus on what actually matters. It's when the real work gets done, when venture capitalists review term sheets, when CFOs finalize acquisition strategies, when legal teams prepare for litigation that could make or break billion-dollar companies. I drove my Tesla down the familiar winding road to the lake house, the same route I'd taken hundreds of times over the past 3 years, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the final board meeting of a hostile takeover, where all the maneuvering and strategic positioning finally culminates in someone signing papers that change everything forever. The house sat in darkness, which meant either Sabrina and Trent had finally figured out that Instagram photo shoots weren't going to solve their legal problems, or they were inside having the kind of panicked conversation that happens when people realize they've been outplayed by someone who understands the rules better than they do. I parked at the bottom of the driveway and walked up the stone pathway I'd had installed 2 summers ago, back when I still thought this marriage might be salvageable and home improvement projects felt like investments in our shared future instead of assets that would eventually need protection through trust documentation. The path led down to the patio where this entire legal drama had started less than 48 hours ago, where Sabrina had dropped her leather folder and delivered her forward ultimatum like she was announcing quarterly earnings to a board of directors. The same patio where she'd been so confident that her separation agreement was going to leave me homeless and humiliated while she redecorated my property with her gym-tanned consultant's questionable taste. I picked up a flat river stone from the decorative border along the pathway. Smooth granite that had probably been tumbling in glacial streams for thousands of years before ending up as landscape design in my backyard. The kind of stone that would make a perfect paperweight for the kind of document that needed to stay exactly where it was placed. From my jacket pocket, I pulled out page 8 of the separation agreement, the page Sabrina had never bothered to read carefully, the page that contained Clause 8, Subsection 3, highlighted in bright yellow like evidence in a securities fraud investigation. The clause that had been sitting there like a legal landmine, waiting for someone to violate its terms through their own careless social media activity. I placed the page on the patio table, centered it carefully like I was positioning a contract for signature during a merger negotiation, and set the river stone on top of it. The stone held the paper perfectly in place, creating the kind of visual metaphor that would make my old English professors proud, while serving as evidence that I'd completed this transaction with the same methodical precision I applied to everything else in my professional life. Underneath the stone, in handwriting that had signed enough acquisition contracts and compliance reports to be instantly recognizable, I wrote a single sentence that I meant exactly as literally as any legal document I'd ever drafted. You wanted me gone. Now I'm just a name you can't erase from the deed or your regrets. No gloating, no emotional dramatics, no angry threats that would make me look unstable if this note ever ended up in court proceedings. Just a factual statement delivered with the kind of clinical precision that makes legal documentation admissible and business correspondence effective. The note was essentially a closing statement, the kind of summary you deliver at the end of a successful litigation when all the evidence has been presented and the opposing counsel has run out of viable defense strategies. It acknowledged what Sabrina had tried to accomplish, documented what had actually happened instead, and established the permanent consequences of her strategic miscalculation. The first part, "You wanted me gone," referenced her original demand from 48 hours ago, the sign or get out ultimatum that she delivered with such theatrical confidence. It showed that I understood her objective, that I'd heard her clearly, and that I didn't hold any personal animosity about her decision to terminate our marriage through legal warfare. The second part, "Now I'm just a name you can't erase," was where the real legal poetry came into play. My name was on the trust documentation as sole trustee and beneficiary. My name was on the property deed as the legal entity controlling occupancy rights. My name was on every piece of corporate paperwork that established ownership of assets she'd tried to claim through her worthless separation agreement. More importantly, my name was now permanently embedded in the legal record of her strategic failure, documented in county filings and court records that would exist long after this marriage was officially dissolved. Every future relationship, every future business venture, every future attempt to present herself as someone who understood how high-stakes negotiations actually worked would be shadowed by the legal trail of her miscalculation. The final part, "from the deed or your regrets," was acknowledgement that some consequences are permanent. Property law doesn't care about your feelings or your social media follower count. Trust documentation doesn't get invalidated by Instagram posts or relationship drama. Legal ownership is determined by paperwork, not by wishful thinking or emotional manipulation. I stood there for a moment, looking at the stone holding down the highlighted page, and felt the same quiet satisfaction that comes from closing a particularly complex acquisition or finalizing a merger that everyone said couldn't be done. The satisfaction of systematic preparation paying off exactly as planned. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the stars like a dark mirror, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the dock where my sailboat was moored. This was the peace I'd been trying to buy when I purchased this property 3 years ago. The calm that comes from being surrounded by assets you actually own, protected by legal structures you actually understand. I walked back to my Tesla as quietly as I'd arrived, leaving no footprints on the stone pathway, making no noise that would wake the occupants inside. The lock on the front door clicked with the same decisive sound as a contract being finalized, a deal being closed, a strategic position being secured. The message would be there when Sabrina woke up, probably sometime after her morning Pilates class and her daily review of social media metrics. She'd find it exactly where I'd placed it, weighted down by granite that had been shaped by geological forces much more powerful and permanent than anything she'd tried to accomplish with her leather folder. The stone would hold until she was ready to read what it was protecting, and then she'd finally understand the difference between feeling powerful and actually having power. By 9:15 a.m. the next morning, Ms. Carmen Rojas had logged the property freeze into the county's permanent record system with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that makes legal documentation more permanent than most marriages. The filing would sit in those records forever, accessible to anyone conducting due diligence on the property, creating the kind of title issue that makes real estate attorneys wake up in cold sweats. Nina had been monitoring the system since dawn, refreshing the county clerk database with the obsessive attention to detail that justifies her six-figure salary and her reputation as someone who could execute complex legal strategies without missing a single procedural deadline. "It's official," she texted me at 9:23 a.m., "freeze is logged, certified copies are being processed, and I've got delivery confirmation set up for all parties. Your soon-to-be ex-wife is about to have a very educational morning." The certified mail notices went out through the Postal Service's priority delivery system, the kind of official correspondence that gets signed for by people who suddenly realize their legal problems have just become significantly more expensive. Sabrina would receive her copies along with a compliance timeline that outlined exactly how the eviction process would unfold if she chose to remain in property she had no legal right to occupy. But the real masterpiece was the trust administrator's involvement. Olamirwaju Okon had been managing high-net-worth estate planning for nearly 15 years, long enough to understand that wealthy people's divorces tend to generate the kind of litigation that makes law firms buy new office furniture with the billable hours. He'd added a compliance watch to the property that would trigger automatic legal notifications if Sabrina tried any creative interpretations of her occupancy rights. Any listing activity, any staging preparation, any attempt to market the property for short-term rental. Okon explained during our morning call, his accent carrying the precision that comes from managing trust assets worth more than small countries' GDP. The system flags everything automatically and sends notices to all relevant parties, including the county clerk and your legal counsel. In other words, eviction wasn't going to be a cliff-edge confrontation where I had to physically remove her belongings while she screamed about her rights. It was going to be a staircase, one procedural step, one legal filing, one administrative hearing at a time, each stage documented with the kind of systematic precision that makes appellate courts very happy and divorce attorneys very rich. I'd moved into a furnished short-term rental near the marina, a clean two-bedroom apartment with hardwood floors and windows that overlooked the harbor where sailboats bobbed like patient investments waiting for the right market conditions. The place came with everything I needed. Reliable internet for managing my business responsibilities, a decent kitchen for the rare occasions when I cooked instead of ordering from restaurants that understood how to prepare food for people with actual disposable income, and enough space to work on the kind of complex contract analysis that kept my company's revenue growing even while my personal life was undergoing corporate-style restructuring. The rental was temporary, obviously, but it served its strategic purpose, establishing that I could maintain my professional obligations and lifestyle independence while the legal machinery ground through its predictable procedures. No dramatic relocations, no desperate couch surfing with friends, no indication that Sabrina's attempted financial warfare had disrupted anything more significant than my morning commute. At noon, I had lunch with Marcus Chun, a friend whose AI startup was tackling compliance automation in healthcare. The kind of regulatory technology that could save hospital systems millions in penalties while protecting patient data with machine learning algorithms that actually understood medical privacy laws instead of just pretending to care about HIPAA compliance. We're looking at series of funding by next quarter. Marcus explained over artisanal sandwiches that cost more than most people's daily food budget. The venture capital interest is serious, especially with the new federal regulations coming online. Healthcare compliance is about to become a billion-dollar market for anyone who can build systems that actually work. I reviewed his pitch deck on my tablet, analyzing the financial projections and market penetration strategy with the same systematic attention I'd applied to my divorce proceedings. Good revenue assumptions, realistic customer acquisition costs, and intellectual property protection that would make patent attorneys proud. The kind of business plan that attracted smart money from investors who understood the difference between genuine innovation and Silicon Valley vaporware. Your legal tech platform could integrate beautifully with our compliance monitoring, Marcus continued. Contract analysis plus regulatory compliance, packaged as a comprehensive B2B solution for enterprise clients who need both services but don't want to manage multiple vendor relationships. We discussed partnership possibilities, licensing agreements, and the kind of strategic alliance structures that could benefit both companies while protecting our respective intellectual property portfolios. Business development conversations that would normally require weeks of preliminary research and legal review, but which felt natural and productive when you're talking with someone who understands how to build systematic value instead of just chasing quarterly metrics. At 3 p.m., I toured the Grand Meridian Ballroom, a venue that charged $78,000 for corporate events and delivered the kind of luxury experience that made clients feel like their money was buying them access to something genuinely exclusive. Crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's houses, marble floors that echoed like a cathedral, and service staff who understood that discretion was just as important as efficiency when you're hosting events for people whose net worth appeared on Forbes lists. We've got availability in October for your company's Series B celebration, the event coordinator explained, showing me floor plans that could accommodate everything from intimate board dinners to full corporate galas. Several clients have been flying in by private jet for events, so we've got helicopter landing coordination if that becomes relevant for your guest list. The venue was exactly the kind of place where successful entrepreneurs celebrated milestone funding rounds, IPO announcements, and the kind of acquisition deals that made TechCrunch headlines. Not because I needed validation from expensive parties, but because public celebrations of business success send important signals to investors, competitors, and potential acquisition targets about your company's market position and growth trajectory. I kept my watch, the Patek Philippe that had survived Sabrina's asset grab because it had been properly documented as inherited property. I kept my work, the legal tech company that was generating revenue and intellectual property value regardless of my marital status. I kept the house, legally, permanently, and with full documentation that would make any future challenges expensive and futile. What I let go of was simpler. The wedding ring that had represented a contract I'd fulfilled completely while the other party had attempted material breach. The noise of someone who confused volume with authority, drama with strategy, Instagram followers with actual influence, and the version of myself that had confused silence with weakness, patience with passivity, systematic preparation with lack of confidence. My silence had been many things over the past week: strategic, methodical, legally precise. But most importantly, it had been a contract. A commitment to letting actions speak louder than arguments, documentation matter more than declarations, and legal preparation triumph over emotional manipulation. Sabrina had finally learned that real power isn't volume or theatrics or social media validation. Real power is paper that holds up in court. And I had all the right paper.